I'm so pleased everybody's here. It's such a great feeling to look out in the crowd and see so many friends and so many people doing amazing work. I am frankly humbled to be serving as your moderator for this panel. My name is Bodie. I'm at the University of Minnesota Law School, and it's my privilege, my honor, and my pleasure to introduce you to the first panel, which is Historical Lessons for Labor Strategy. We have a brief description of the panel. I just want to set the stage with it. We are in an era of renewed labor ferment, with dramatically rising interest in labor organizing alongside deficient legislative frameworks and a hostile judiciary. What can historical perspectives on labor movement strategies teach us about the potential and the limits of organized labor power today? The panelist scholarly projects examine what lessons today's labor activists might draw from the successes and failures of union civil liberties and civil rights lawyers in the mid-20th century, when I might add, unions represented a third of the private sector workforce as opposed to now, it's around 6%. All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce this great group of panelists. I will go in order of presentation. So first is Catherine Fisk. She is the Barbara McAfee Armstrong Distinguished Professor of Law at UC Berkeley. Her presentation draws on her research for a book on progressive union employers in the mid-20th century. I should add these bios are criminally insufficient, but in the interest of time, we are keeping them brief. Our next speaker will be Laura Weinrib. She is the Fred and Fishman Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School and the Suzanne Young Murray Professor at Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. A legal historian, she is currently writing a book on unions, corporations, and money in politics from the New Deal to the Nixon administration. Final panelist will be Diana Reddy. She is a PhD candidate in UC Berkeley's Jurisprudence and Social Policy program and a former labor lawyer. Before her return to academia, she represented unions and workers at the AFL-CIO, Altshuler-Berzon LLP, and the California Teachers Association. Her article, After the Law of Apolitical Economy, Reclaiming the Normative Stakes of Labor Unions, draws from her dissertation research on labor union legitimacy. And it was officially published today, downloadable from the Yale Law Journal. So if you haven't seen it already, please check it out. All right, I will hand things off to these great panelists, and there will be Q&A immediately following their presentations. We do not have microphones, so please raise your hand and speak loudly, and we will really be excited to get involved and hear your thoughts on these great presentations. So,
labor unions spent the late 19th century and the early 20th fighting for freedom from state repression. In the economic collapse and labor upsurge of the 1930s, labor won legal recognition of rights to unionize, bargain collectively, strike, picket, and boycott. Those legal victories proved short-lived. Beginning in 1942, the Supreme Court steadily pared back labor's constitutional right to protest. In January 1942, the right to strike was suspended for the duration of the war. In 1946, when the no strike promises lapsed, companies refused to meet the pent-up demand for wage increases as they returned to a market economy without guaranteed wartime profits. A huge strike wave emboldened the new Republican congressional majority to make attacking labor's power a key part of their agenda. And Congress delivered to business much of what it had wanted since labor first gained legal protection in 1932. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 protected non-union employers and employees from some organizing and a lot of protest. It authorized the National Labor Relations Board to seek injunctions against labor organizing tactics that violated the new statutory restrictions. And it authorized suit against a union by any person, quote, injured in his business or property by violation of the new restrictions for damages caused by union activists. Labor law thus made union leaders, quote unquote, responsibility, that is their capacity to restrain collective activity of workers, the criterion for union institutional security. Some union leadership and union lawyers embraced it, including CIO General Counsel Arthur Goldberg, the only union general counsel ever to serve on the Supreme Court. Others deplored Taft-Hartley and the concept of responsibility. But like it or not, the collective bargaining system forced both the NLRB and union leaders alike to go of labor upsurge, to tell the rank and file to, quote, lie down like good dogs, as one NLRB agent said of a dock worker strike in Juneau, Alaska in 1948. Nevertheless, legal recognition, even with the constraints of no strike clauses, was better than legal repression. Enforcing a collective bargaining agreement does not demand constant mobilization to exert effective control over working conditions. Moreover, labor generally found that contracts were better than litigation, where unions encountered judicial hostility, especially, although not only, in state courts. And labor got nowhere with federal legislation after 1935. Congress has not since then enacted any law that protects workers' collective power. Through contracts, targeted strikes, and political activism, unions built considerable social, economic, and political power as institutions. And unlike many social movements, they claim now and claim then to speak for a majority. But the labor contract framework vastly increased the cost to the movement of using direct action protest tactics. Putting bodies in the street to protest injustice and to assert power could fray the relationships that gave unions their power. It also risked the financial solvency of unions and thereby risked the destruction of labor's ability to assert power in the workplace. It could even threaten destruction of the movement. Resisting the movement restraining aspects of labor law was a constant struggle for union lawyers, who were, after all, the fulcrum of the government's efforts to de-radicalize labor. The period of the 50s was the era when unions had more institutional power and, as Matt pointed out, a larger membership than any other social movement organization in American history. But it was also a period when a tidal wave of red baiting rolled over the country. It was a more aggressive national campaign of legal repression based on ideology than any that has occurred before or since. And here I want to focus on three prongs of the government's attack. First, as the price for enforcing worker rights under the NLRA, the Taft-Hartley Act compelled unions to conduct inquisitions of their own leadership and banish from leadership any who refused to swear an anti-communist oath. Under enormous pressure to prove itself anti-communist, the CIO, which had been the most progressive activist institution in the labor movement, purged the 11 unions whose leaders refused to sign the non-communist affidavit. But these were also among the unions that had been most committed to organizing on an industry-wide, racially and gender-inclusive basis. The remaining affiliates of the CIO, along with many AFL unions, raided the membership of the purged unions. The internecine struggles that followed consumed time and energy. They alienated labor supporters and weakened the entire movement. And the purge contributed to the failure of Operation Dixie, which was the CIO's big effort to organize workers in the South on a multiracial basis. The second prong of the government's attack is the best known. The House Un-American Activities Committee subpoenaed union leaders to testify about their beliefs in Washington and in hearings across the country. At those hearings, lawyers were largely prohibited to speak. And indeed, HUAC subpoenaed union lawyers too, trying to force them to turn against their colleagues, their clients, and their friends. The third prong of the attack was equally vicious, but less well known. The US Department of Justice sent teams of lawyers across the country to prosecute union leaders and activists under the Anti-Sedition Smith Act of 1940. The crime was belonging to the Communist Party. There were trials against leftists in every state that had a significant union movement, from New York to Hawaii. Those lawyers who had the temerity to call out the government for engaging in political prosecutions, who included union lawyers Richard Gladstein of San Francisco, George Crockett of Detroit, and Harriet Bauslog of Hawaii, were either held in contempt and sentenced to prison along with their clients, or disbarred, or both. The Smith Act prosecutions were, in most places, a deliberate effort to squelch union activism. Take the case of Hawaii in 1951. The International Longshore and Warehouse Workers Union had shaken up the Hawaiian power structure by successfully organizing across boundaries of race and occupation until workers from the ports to the pineapple and sugar plantations were all in one big union. That organizing flipped Hawaii from the red plantation state that it was to the blue state it is today. The government indicted 7 people active in the effort, including the ILWU's regional director, Jack Hall. Sending activists and their lawyers off to prison at the conclusion of what was obviously a political trial sent shockwaves through lawyers on the left, but not through the rest of the bar. It was indeed what Attorney General Tom Clark had called for in 1946 when he charged at a bar association speech that lawyers on the left were exploiting the civil rights issue to divide the country. Lawyers, Clark insisted, needed to be vigilant against, quote, the revolutionary who enters our ranks, takes the solemn oath of our calling, and then uses every device in the legal category to further the interests of those who would destroy our government, close quote. The Bar Association, he warned, should, quote, take those 2 brilliant brothers of ours to the legal woodshed for a definite and well-deserved admonition. This 3-pronged attack on the labor left worked exactly as intended. The labor movement after the repression and purges of the 50s was, with some exceptions, more conservative and quiescent than it had been before. Some leaders were less committed to fighting for racial equality or to organizing the unorganized. To be sure, survivors of the purges of the 50s were crucial to the civil rights and anti-poverty campaigns of the 60s. But the power that labor unions wielded in the 1950s has never since been equaled. And it's not because labor leaders were unwise or indifferent to racial or gender inequality or had become disillusioned with leftism, although some were. It's because the government, at the behest of the Chamber of Commerce, drove radicals out of the labor movement. Even the labor unions that had been the most progressive in the 1930s adopted one of 2 strategies to survive this attack. There was the moderate liberalism of the UAW. In 1947, a year after Walter Reuther became the union president, he purged the radical lawyers who had been the union's general counsel from its founding, as well as some leaders. The UAW afterwards combined very successful business unionism with political influence, especially, although not only in Washington, through its general counsel, the notable Joe Rao. I don't want to underestimate the efficacy of the strategy or the UAW's contributions to the civil rights movement, although it wasn't always positive. But the UAW did use its considerable resources to create a bail fund for civil rights activists in the early 1960s, lobbied for the Civil Rights Act of '64, et cetera. The second strategy was intermittent continued radicalism combined with business unionism. This was the path of the ILWU. The Longshore Union refused to purge its leaders who refused to sign a non-communist affidavit. The government persisted, trying 4 times to deport ILWU President Harry Bridges, alleging that he was a communist, and 4 times ILWU lawyers beat back the effort. Today, the union is a shadow of its former size because the stevedoring companies figured out ways to automate the work through the use of shipping containers. Although its membership is small and quite well paid, it remains surprisingly radical, actually. They still engage in political strikes, most recently in the summer of 2020, when they shut down the Port of Oakland for a day in support of Black Lives Matter and to protest the murder of George Floyd. But the ILWU's commitment to occasional activism and its very high degree of solidarity periodically gets it into enormous trouble. Right now, and not for the first time, it is appealing a damages judgment large enough to bankrupt the entire union. And make no mistake, the Supreme Court's anticipated decision this term in the Glacier Northwest case is almost certain to expand tort liability for strikes. And it is aimed squarely at union activism, and I think will be used for exactly that purpose. Finally, it's worth remembering that the price of mass movement power is not just repression by law, it's also grappling with some degree of coercion that flows from the solidarity that's necessary to exert power. Until the organizing at Amazon and Starbucks and the University of California strike pushed them off the front page, the unions that tended to be much in the news were police unions and teachers unions. Both of these unions have been harshly criticized by the right, but also by the left for the political power they wield and for how they choose to use it. They are accused, not without some basis, for pursuing their members' interests in pay, job security, and job quality at the expense of the public interest. And each one is accused of having too much political power and of using that power to advocate for policies that don't serve the interest of all their members and don't serve the public interest. And so it's helpful when you read a criticism of either of those unions or any other to think about what extent you think the moral worth of the members of the union and the positions they take should be the basis for criticizing unionism and their solidarity more generally. Outside of those examples, though, labor is so weak, it's hard to worry too much about unions having too much power. But I was asked to talk about lessons from the past, and so to sum up, here are 4. Number 1, union weakness today is the product in part of legal repression from an era when unions were strong. Number 2, one form legal repression took was to exploit divisions between the moderate left and the far left. And the left has always been especially prone to circular firing squads. It was a mistake then, and in my view, it was a mistake now. Third, if unions get strong again, expect repression to ramp up, and the tools are still there. Fourth, as you think about worker power, focus not only on the workers or the unions you like, but think about the ones you don't like. That's why I've been writing about police unions, not my favorite union. But ask yourself whether a legal regime that allows worker power only if the union meets someone's test of moral acceptability can reliably protect worker power. Unions have always struggled with failing the moral test of the business community or some faction of the left. And that's always been a real thorn in the side of worker solidarity. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm really thrilled to be part of this conference and also this panel. I think there are really neat resonances between the three papers, and a lot of what I'm going to say today is going to follow nicely from what Catherine just said. As Matt mentioned, I'm talking today about a new project I'm working on, very new, which is about unions, business groups, and the regulation of money and politics between the New Deal and the 1970s. I've actually been planning this for quite a while, but because of COVID, I've only recently been able to get into the archives of the major business lobbyists and labor groups that played a prominent role in the story. So I'm still sifting through my many photos of archival documents, and everything I'm going to say today is really preliminary, and I'm also especially eager for feedback. But with that disclaimer, this project takes as its starting point two propositions that are going to be familiar to everyone in the room. First, that economic inequality in the United States is rapidly rising and, of course, is deeply shaped by our legal regime, sometimes transparently, sometimes through exercises of so-called private law. And second, that political spending in the United States is out of control. And the part of that spending that comes from big donors comes disproportionately from corporations, business executives, and business advocacy groups. So let me start by saying that I think these two developments are related. And by that, I don't just mean that business executives have more resources than their employees to devote to political spending, or that political spending by corporations undermines support for redistributive programs, though, of course, both are true. What I want to suggest today is that on a more fundamental level, contestation over political spending has shaped who has power and how that power is exercised in the United States. And to understand why, I think we have to shift the focus somewhat from the usual emphasis in the debate over money and politics on laws and litigation targeting corporate money. That's a story that often begins with the Federal Corrupt Practices Act in the early 20th century, then skips to the Federal Election Campaign Act, and to the famous First Amendment cases extending constitutional protection to campaign spending, and eventually to corporate campaign spending. There's been a big emphasis in that history on the 1970s, the Powell memo, and the rapid escalation in pro-business spending that followed. Now, those developments are, of course, important, but I want to suggest that they did not, in fact, begin in the 1970s. Instead, they built on decades of litigation and debate over political spending by unions. As many people in this room have pointed out, the fact that corporations are free to spend as much as they want on elections and political advocacy today might not be such a big problem if there were equivalent funding on the other side of basic economic issues. And indeed, union funding used to be a counterweight to corporate spending. The period of peak union strength was also the height of the Great Compression. There's increasing evidence to suggest that that relationship is causal. It's in effect largely driven by the fact that unions raise wages within the workplace, but it's also because unions advocated for legislation that mitigates inequalities, progressive tax structures, government infrastructure projects, expanding social welfare programs. And I should add that despite unions' tragic failings during this period with respect to race discrimination in the workplace and within their own ranks, as Catherine mentioned, they did push hard for the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and other legislative measures to reduce both racial and economic inequality. And there's evidence to suggest that those efforts made a difference. Okay, so if union spending was so important, where did all that spending go? It's not that unions don't have a right to engage in political spending. When the court struck down limits on corporate campaign spending in Citizens United, its holding extended to labor unions' expenditures from their general treasuries as well. The short answer, which follows on what Catherine just told us, is that union spending in the United States has declined because unions in the United States have declined. Perhaps Michigan gives us reason to be hopeful, but there's little doubt about the general trend here. Over the past decades, union funds have declined, and especially union power has declined. And what I want to propose today is that unions' constitutional campaign against efforts to limit their political spending is part of the reason why. So to explain what I mean, I need to walk us back to the 1930s. Before the New Deal, unions in the United States were ambivalent about engaging in political activity, and they pushed strongly for regulation of campaign spending. But during the 1930s, as New Deal legislation fueled organizing drives that dramatically expanded union power and influence, political activity and political spending started to look a lot more appealing. Now, needless to say, both business groups and their allies in Congress understood the danger that union political activity posed, and they were determined to do something about it. Beginning in 1939, Congress responded to business advocacy by introducing restrictions on the ability of labor unions to contribute to federal elections. The first significant restriction was a wartime measure. Then, with the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act, Congress made the wartime restrictions on union campaign spending permanent. And it wasn't just the laws that targeted unions. Enforcement efforts also disproportionately targeted unions. Virtually every federal campaign finance prosecution between 1940 and 1970 involved unions, not corporations. States soon followed suit, passing their own laws and pursuing their own prosecutions to limit union power. So what did unions do? They resisted all that regulation. When Congress banned labor union contributions to candidates, unions responded by creating PACs. Perhaps more importantly, unions continued to spend huge sums from their general treasuries on activity that fell outside the formal bans. They contributed to state and local elections. They engaged in educational and get out the vote activities, and they continued to pour money into federal elections too, developing for the first time the distinction between contributions to candidates and parties on the one hand and independent expenditures on the other, a distinction that would come to have great significance in constitutional law. Unions publicly opposed efforts to curb their spending, and they did so because they believed their influence depended on it. As AFL-CIO President George Meany famously put it in 1955, the scene of the battle is no longer the company plant and the picket line. It has moved into the legislative halls of Congress and the state legislatures. And of course, to the extent the labor movement wanted to keep spending money in the face of regulation, the scene of the battle was also the courts. Okay, so there's a lot to say about the resultant conflict, but I want to focus on two core points. First, it was unions, not corporations, that pioneered the First Amendment arguments against campaign regulation in the courts. And second, the principles underlying those decisions operated simultaneously to undermine union power in the United States. To be clear, the First Amendment arguments unions made to defend political spending in the middle of the 20th century were not the same ones that, say, businesses had made to defend lobbying and other business activity during the New Deal, which I've written about in previous work. When unions demanded invalidation of campaign finance laws on First Amendment grounds, they were advancing a kind of group rights theory of the First Amendment, an argument that free speech, like meaningful bargaining, required countervailing power. But that kind of argument, frankly, was an awkward fit for the American constitutional tradition. The court did constrain the reach of the campaign finance provisions during this period through creative statutory interpretation, preserving some scope for union spending. But during the decades of peak union power, the justices declined to clad that union spending in constitutional armor. For their part, anti-union advocates soon hit upon a more palatable strategy. So corporations in the 1940s felt that they couldn't defeat unions by criticizing their threat to property rights, as they'd done before until the New Deal, or even by denouncing union monopoly. And that's because strong unions, as a counterweight to employer power in the workplace, were broadly appealing to Americans in the middle of the 20th century. What Americans didn't like, indeed what Americans still don't like, was money in politics. In fact, polling data by business advocacy groups consistently found that around 70% of Americans opposed the use of union dues to fund political spending. And that number held even among union members. So in both public and legislative debate, anti-union advocates seized on public hostility to union political influence. They retooled their old arguments about voluntary unionism as an argument about political rather than economic coercion. And it worked. These arguments helped anti-union legislators to enact major limitations on union security agreements and concerted activity in the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act. As Catherine explained, Taft-Hartley fundamentally changed American labor law, among other things, by prohibiting closed shops and authorizing so-called right-to-work laws. And within the next decade, union opponents used the rhetoric of political coercion to get right-to-work laws passed in almost 20 states. Often, I should add, by emphasizing that involuntary contributions to unions were funding civil rights legislation. In all of this, business groups were careful to limit their criticism to union political involvement, as opposed to their workplace activity. So to give you a sense of how this strategy played out, I'm just going to quote from a 1956 address by the president of NAM, National Association of Manufacturers. He said, "Before I am accused of union busting, I want to make NAM's position unmistakably clear. NAM believes that employees should have the right to bargain collectively through representatives of their choosing. But NAM also believes that the Corrupt Practices Act should be applicable to labor unions as well as corporations." And he concluded, "We do not believe union leaders should be permitted to use union funds for partisan political purposes when many members wish to support some other party or candidate." Okay, so it will presumably come as no surprise that business advocates invoked these arguments in court as well as in public and legislative debate. At first, they invoked them to defeat rather than support First Amendment claims. They argued that avoiding compulsory support for union political activity furnished what we would today call a compelling government interest for limiting union expenditures. Soon after that, they began developing a strategy to transform the political autonomy of union bargaining unit members into a First Amendment right of its own. Unions responded that they were democratic institutions governed by an electoral process, and that was protection enough for minorities. But with a couple of early exceptions, that argument found a chilly reception on the court. I'm not going to say much about the right to work cases today, but I do want to stress that early litigation chipping away at agency fees was directed not at unions' collective bargaining expenses, but at their political spending. And I don't think that political angle was just an entering wedge. After Taft-Hartley, again, as Catherine said, unions' economic power was pretty well hemmed in. Assuming that is that unions weren't able to mobilize to repeal Taft-Hartley. On the other hand, business lobbyists in the 1950s and 60s were really worried about union political spending and its influence on candidates' policy and legislation. In short, in the face of anti-labor efforts to undermine union security on First Amendment grounds, the fact that unions were claiming a First Amendment right to influence politics became their Achilles heel. Increasingly, they fought to frame all of their activity, picketing, boycotts, campaign spending, as political speech instead of economic power. And they justified all that political activity as expressive and associational. But the upshot was that unions made the right not to engage in those activities expressive and associational too. By the time the court considered the constitutionality of union shop agreements under the Railway Labor Act and International Association of Machinists v. Street in 1961, it was easy for the majority to conclude, in the shadow of the First Amendment, that unions may not exact money to support the political activities in which they engage. A decade later, when the justices excluded union political funds from the reach of campaign finance laws as a matter of constitutional avoidance, they were careful to limit their holding to what they called knowing free choice donations. Similar language and reasoning appeared in cases upholding right to work laws and upholding bans on labor picketing against unions' First Amendment challenges. So the path that unions embarked on in the 1930s and 40s eventually led to Janus v. AFSCME. It will likely lead to the invalidation of private sector agency fees on First Amendment grounds and perhaps an end to majority rule and exclusive representation as well. As for Citizens United, I can't help but suspect that the court finally recognized unions' right to engage in political spending precisely because unions have lost their power to serve as an effective counterweight to business advocacy. When labor advocates first defended their political spending on First Amendment grounds, they believed that First Amendment neutrality could yield meaningful contestation in the realm of electoral politics, just as they believed that state neutrality in labor relations could yield meaningful bargaining between unions and employer. Both positions assumed the ability of workers to aggregate their power. But if labor's position on campaign spending remained consistent through the 20th century, the premises on which it rested were radically shifting. Increasingly, the court's formal neutrality in First Amendment cases masked statutory and constitutional impediments to exercising collective power. The court's refusal in Berkeley v. Vallejo to restrict the speech of some in order to enhance the relative voice of others was starting to look like Lochnerism in First Amendment dress. In fact, even as labor unions lost their power and funds over the course of the 20th century, corporate political spending was exploding. And that story, too, has much to do with the campaign finance cases. A 1956 NAM Law Department memo surmised that the court's statutory protections for union spending would apply to corporate spending as well. And so, despite initial reluctance to publicly enter the political fray, business groups formed their own PACs and launched their own spending campaigns. Under the statute, NAM concluded, what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Okay, wrapping up. I've come to believe that unions' extension into electoral politics was both necessary to union power in the middle of the 20th century and paradoxically responsible for its decline. I also believe strongly that a resurgence of union power is critical to reversing the rapidly rising economic inequality that plagues the United States today, and that the dominance of corporate money in American politics is both exacerbating inequality and undermining unions. So where does all this leave us? I think it's unlikely that judicial interpretation of the First Amendment can ever countenance the forms of solidarity on which union power historically rested. I'm eager to think through paths forward during the Q&A. For now, I'll just speculate that if the labor movement is to serve once again as a counterweight to capital, it will need either to reimagine labor power or to rethink the valorization of choice and voluntariness that infuses political liberalism.
Hello, everyone. I'm just delighted to be here today with all of you, with Laura, with Catherine, with Matt. When I was in law school many years ago, when I was a practicing labor lawyer, even when I started the PhD program, I could not have imagined a gathering like this. So I just, again, thank you to all of you for being here in this room and online, and to the organizers. This is remarkable. So what I want to talk about is how we understand labor unions. And I think the under-theorized role of law in shaping American discourse about what labor unions are and why they're important. So let me start by contextualizing this conversation with some present-day empirical data, which may be familiar to many of you in this room, but may also be surprising to others. So over the past 10 years, we have seen a huge increase in public support for labor unions. This is from a historic low of 48% in 2009, which is, as you can see, the lowest level of public support in the history of polling public support of labor unions, to 71% today. It's as high as public support for unions has been in 60 years. A recent article was said that the American public is in love with labor unions. But while I think this is incredibly promising news for those of us who believe labor unions have an important role to play in American society, I want to suggest that even at this level of public support, the American conversation about labor unions remains constrained by the legacy of what I call the law of a political economy. And here you will start to see through lines from all of what everyone else has said about the distinctions that have been drawn between the political and the economic, particularly under the First Amendment, when it comes to unions. So by the law of a political economy, I mean how unions were force fit into the new constitutional equilibrium, which followed the New Deal. During this time, they were categorized as engaging in commercial activity rather than advancing inherently normative claims about workplace justice. And I think that history still matters today, that it continues to shape how we understand the stakes of what labor unions do, even with support as high as it is. Over the past decade, following what I think is a real crisis of labor union legitimacy, following the Great Recession, when conservatives particularly attacked public sector unions, unions and their supporters have been doing a lot of work to reclaim a normative vision, to explain to the public why unions are normatively important. In so doing, there's been a lot of emphasis on the broad social causes with well-defined political stakes that labor unions contribute to. But what I want to suggest is what this argumentation has not fully done is rebuild what was originally lost to the law of a political economy, which is an understanding of the workplace itself as a site of unfreedom and inequality, and a clear-eyed normative defense of the leading statutory role of unions, which is allowing workers to come together in the workplace to improve their job. So to make this claim, my paper draws from history, sociological theory, and some contemporary survey research, including some exploratory work I did in 2019. So I'll talk briefly through each of those pieces today. But uniting all of them is an argument that law has played an under-theorized role in shaping how we understand labor unions and their stakes, in part through drawing lines, through creating categories that have had enduring material and symbolic effect. And just to be clear, I think this all really matters. For unions to regain real strength in the US, I am convinced requires some legal change. And that requires some amount of public support if we believe that our democracy still works as a democracy. And I think to create that public support, to create that legal change, we need a more robust understanding of the normative stakes of labor unions. So I'll start with a brief discussion of history. There's a rich body of labor legal history, and the story that often tells is how labor law de-radicalized labor unions, how it channeled them into narrow collective bargaining relationships when they once had more transformational goals. So I don't in any way disagree with the thrust of that literature, but I want to intervene to say that I think law has done something else. It has obfuscated the normative stakes of what labor unions still do. It has categorized what unions still do in the workplace as commerce, as transactional, rather than about values and moral commitments. I think law has helped construct good jobs as an economic issue rather than a human rights issue. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, unionists and the broader public often talked about labor unions as effectuating core American normative commitments. We talked about ideals of labor republicanism, of industrial democracy, and increasingly unions claimed that they exercised or helped effectuate foundational fundamental rights under the first, 13th, and 14th Amendments. But in the economic devastation of the Great Depression, liberal economists and policymakers began to advance a new understanding of unions as good economic policy. At that time, in the economic devastation of the Great Depression, there was a relatively shared consensus that economic inequality had contributed to the Depression because it concentrated too much money in too few hands. And so to stabilize and to grow the economy required people to start buying things again, and that required that they had income. Because unions could help workers increase their income, they could be vectors of increased aggregate demand, they could help stabilize and grow the economy. These beliefs were early pillars of a theory of economics, later attributed primarily to John Maynard Keynes. And so legal scholar Joel Rogers has said that it was the alchemy of Keynesianism that helped legitimize labor law, because Keynesianism said that what unions did for their members also benefited society as a whole. And so here in the preamble to the National Labor Relations Act, you see the coexistence of both types of arguments. Here at the top, you see the normative stuff, these really heterodox constitutional rights claims about full freedom of association and actual liberty of contract. But these are contained in a subordinate clause on the way to the primary justification for the law, which is about economic policy, concerns about preventing business depressions and reducing burdens on commerce. So to be clear, this is partly strategic language oriented towards surviving Supreme Court review. Drafters have decided to tie their claims of the statute's constitutionality to the Commerce Clause. But unlike in other areas of law where the Commerce Clause has been widely understood as just a technical hook, this framing is more than that. It also reflects a changing understanding on the ground, particularly among elite policymakers, of what unions do and why people should support them. Now, multiple rationales for a legal regime is perfectly fine and need not inherently create a tension. And for a few years, there was no tension between these two types of defenses of unionism. So in the 1937 Supreme Court case in LRB versus Jones and Laughlin, finding the National Labor Relations Act constitutional as an exercise of the Commerce Clause, the court, again, both accepted the arguments that strikes and worker dissatisfaction had impacts on commerce, and for that reason, the statute was constitutional. And also, for the first time and only time in the history of Supreme Court jurisprudence on labor unions, they commented almost as an aside, employees have a fundamental right to self-organization and to select representatives of their own choosing. But this dual understanding of labor law as both good economic regulation and effectuating fundamental rights, I think began to fall apart almost immediately as the post-Lochner liberal vision of judicial review began to take shape. Just a year later, the Supreme Court decides Caroline Products, a decision that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And here the court summed up its new approach to judicial review, the crux of which was that economic regulation does not have constitutional implications. On the one hand, you have ordinary commercial transactions, which should be left to the rational decision-making of legislators based on their knowledge and experience. On the other hand, you have foundational constitutional commitments, fundamental rights, and checks on the exploitation of discrete and insular minorities, things that transcend a rational basis, that transcend the knowledge and experience of legislators. And so while the broader impacts of Caroline Products, I think, have been well discussed, I think there hasn't been enough attention to what this meant for labor unions. Because after Caroline Products, unionism and union activity are increasingly categorized as engaged in economic activity. as opposed to effectuating fundamental rights or even more normative commitments at a time when it really seemed possible, according to Jones and Laughlin, that things could have gone either way. So we talk about the doctrinal fallout more in the paper, but I want to focus here a little bit more on my theorization of the longer term consequences. Why I think this legal framing mattered outside the courtroom. So first of all, unions framing is engaged in commercial speech, means that notwithstanding a brief period of First Amendment solace, as both of my esteemed panelists have pointed out, it did not last. Labor protest is increasingly seen as a regulatory issue rather than a constitutional one. And this changes what labor protest looks like. It makes it too costly for unions to continue to engage in the kind of broad solidarity building protests that originally built the labor movement. As I've written elsewhere, this paradigm made strikes and labor protests into economic weapons to be wielded against the employer, as opposed to a way of engaging the policy about what's right and wrong, the polity about what's right and wrong. More symbolically, I want to suggest that this decision increasingly shapes how people actually talk about what they're doing. When unions collectively bargain in the workplace, that's just economics. Core democratic and political commitments are in another category. Certainly, unions still engage in politics increasingly through their contributions of money to electoral politics. But what they do in the workplace, that's just economics. I think this becomes increasingly important with the rise of the rights-based social movements, the rights revolutions of the 1950s and 1960s, where social movements began protesting in the public sphere, using precisely what unions had just abandoned, a language of rights. They're juridical movements, and they invoke constitutional visions and claims. During this time period, sociologists say that rights became the master frame for expressing social movement grievances. Meaningful social issues are a matter of rights, but unions no longer advance independent rights claims. Their causes can intersect with other rights claims. They can oppose civil rights, as some did. They can advance civil rights, as some did, but their bread and butter work has nothing to do with rights. So I want to fast forward briefly to two Supreme Court decisions that I think reflect the ultimate consequence of this way of thinking about labor unions as mere economic regulation. Because here we see how the Supreme Court has justified treating labor unions as fundamentally distinct from real social movements. So in the case of NAACP versus Claiborne Hardware, decided in 1982, the court ruled on the question of whether protest and economic boycotts organized by NAACP chapters, whether they had a First Amendment protection from liability from some of the costs associated with the protest. This was part of the NAACP's Don't Shop Where You Can't Work campaign, in which they urged community members not to shop at local businesses that would refuse to hire Black people. And some local businesses argued that the NAACP should be held liable for the damages that resulted. And the Supreme Court said no, that would chill important First Amendment values to hold protesters liable for this political act. And in having to reach that conclusion, they were asked, well, when unions engage in this kind of activity, you have not found there to be First Amendment implications. And the court says, well, here, this is about racial discrimination, and that differentiates the case from a boycott organized for economic ends, for speech to protest racial discrimination is essential political speech lying at the core of the First Amendment. And of course, what's so fascinating about this conclusion is that while civil rights speech as a category and labor speech have often looked different, in this instance, they looked remarkably similar. These were community members organizing a boycott because they wanted jobs, because they wanted greater economic freedom. But the court is able to see this protest in this under the civil rights heading as rights, as about a fundamental right, political speech under the First Amendment, where it hasn't in labor cases. And then to move on, there's another case, FTC versus Superior Court trial lawyers, in which again, the court found that a group of lawyers who refused to take criminal cases until they were paid, until the government agreed to a higher rate of pay. And they were sued as for committing an antitrust violation. The lawyers argued that they were engaging in this kind of economic protest, as in Claiborne Hardware. And again, the court says, no, here these workers sought an economic advantage for those who agreed to participate, while those who joined the Claiborne Hardware boycott sought no special advantage for themselves. So for these two reasons, because labor speech is economic and because it offers a special advantage for those who participate, it has been distinguished as fundamentally different, as apolitical relative to real social movements. So to be clear, this categorization scheme works for a very long time. Unions' institutional power was reasonable economic regulation. And through that gloss, unions had power and substantial public support through the 1960s. I want to suggest that this changes, though, with the massive change in reigning economic paradigms that we see in the 1970s. In 1970s, part due to economic changes as well as political changes, Keynesianism starts to lose credibility as the dominant economic paradigm. Within the academic study of economics, there is a return to neoclassical principles. And from the perspective of neoclassical economics, it's less clear if unions are an economic good. They are arguably a legally constructed monopoly that can distort the efficient operation of the labor market, potentially benefiting their members through rent seeking, but not anyone else. So this changed academic approach is also mobilized in broader society by politicians. This is supply side economics. This is trickle down economics. And this changed the economic discourse that had justified the National Labor Relations Act. So Keynesian economics had said that what benefited workers benefited everyone. Neoliberal economics says the opposite. What's good for businesses is good for everyone. Businesses are job creators. If we regulate businesses, it hurts everyone. So as rational policy based on the knowledge and expertise of legislatures or policymakers, unions no longer make sense. So when the NLRA was enacted, the economic arguments for unions coexisted with a robust and I think broadly shared normative understanding of why unions are important. But when unions lost the economic argument in the 70s and the 80s, I want to suggest that the most compelling normative arguments for them had now been lost in the public sphere, largely to the law of a political economy. So briefly, in conclusion, I want to bring us back to 2009 and why I think this still matters today. Again, I see 2009 as a moment where all of this history that I've recounted came to a head. Unions have lost the economic argument, and they're floundering in terms of asserting a compelling normative argument in the face of really well-funded attacks on labor unions from conservatives who argue, who at this time there was a billboard in Times Square saying Randy Weingarten protects bad teachers. So there was this really strong normative attack on labor unions, and labor unions had not yet figured out how to respond. So at that time, it felt like it might be the end of labor unions. But instead, we see this kind of really remarkable change, this really rapid increase in public support. And so in the second part of the paper, which I'll just briefly discuss, I make sense of this as unions trying to reclaim the normative stakes of what they do. Having lost the economic argument, they are forced to engage and say why unions further a social good. But in so doing, I want to suggest that they've still been held back by the cultural legacy of the law of a political economy. So unions and their supporters have done great work to say why unions benefit a host of other social causes. But I think they're still struggling to reclaim what was lost to the law of a political economy. Again, the piece of what they do, allowing workers to come together in their workplace to have greater autonomy, freedom, and economic security in the workplace. That was the piece treated as most transactional, as most self-interested by the law of a political economy. We're still struggling to see that as a normative good. And so in the paper, I talk a bit about some of the ways in which labor unions have reframed themselves as bargaining for the common good, as advancing the cause of the 99%, and as benefiting marginalized workers more than anyone. But in order to test the robustness of increased public support, I ran an exploratory survey experiment in 2019, in which I exposed respondents to a number of different ways of framing labor unions. So they were randomly assigned to different conditions, or they read letters to the editor with different ways of talking about labor unions, including some of these frames here, but also a frame that said, labor unions are great because they help workers have better jobs. There was also a control condition in which people were not exposed to a frame, and instead they were just asked about their baseline level of support for labor unions. And so I'll only talk about two of the results here, and the results of the frame that emphasize that labor unions help workers improve their jobs. So first of all, those who were exposed to that frame found it very hard to remember. At the end of the survey experiment, I asked people, do you remember the gist of what you read? Only 41% of people, of respondents, were able to remember that they had been told that workers create good jobs. Whereas for the marginalized worker frame, economic populism frame, those results were in the high 60s, high 70s. Second, those who were able to remember that they were told that labor unions help workers improve their jobs expressed a lower level of support for unions than people who had not been exposed to any frame. So what that means is that people in the study felt more positively about unions when just imagining them in their head than when having had just read and remembering a letter ostensibly written by a union worker saying that unions improved their jobs. That meant when they read that, they liked unions less. This is the letter. And as you can see, it emphasizes that unions create good jobs, that they're justly compensated and secure. And it acknowledges, though, that these are benefits that largely accrue, at least in the first instance, to those who do the work of organizing. And this is the language that was associated with lower support. And I think this should be I consider this to be partly the legacy of the law of a political economy. Here, when the unions talk about their statutory mandate, it is understood as economic and self-interested, and therefore not worthy of the same kind of public support as real social movements. So because I was an organizer before I was a lawyer, and I think it's really important to conclude with optimism, I want to say I think it's a great concern that public support for unions may not be as robust as it appears to be. But I think the story of the law of a political economy is actually a really hopeful one, because we've been held back from making some of the strongest normative arguments for labor unions by this legal and institutional infrastructure. And so there's a lot of work to be done, but there are arguments available. And as we think about how best to express the normative stakes of labor unions, there's a lot to be created anew, but there's also a lot to be reclaimed. And those include concepts like full freedom of association and actual liberty of contract. Thank you.
All right, yes, we have until 2 o'clock, it's about 10 minutes from now. Those of you in the room, I think we're going to count on you for our questions. So please raise your hand and have it calling you if we do have a microphone up here if you prefer to use one, but otherwise we'd love for you to just stand where you are and just shoot your question up to our great panelists here.
So thank you for these fabulous presentations. I want to try to ask you to dive a little bit into the last half sentence in Laura's presentation, because Catherine gave us a classic story of class conflict with the state aligned with capitalists, deploying law as a weapon to suppress labor. And her anticipation is that should labor become powerful, we should expect that both the dynamics and the tools are still there. Laura somewhat supported that with the enforcement story in particular, but also, both in your prior work and now, emphasized the deep tension between liberal ideology and the architecture of liberal law as individual rights as fundamentally in tension with the possibility of labor unions as the arm in the way that when you conceive of it as class conflict simpliciter, it would be. So I'm curious for all three of you, how do you think of the relation? And Diana talked about the change in the governing ideology of the professional managerial class toward economism of the neoclassical sort and neoliberalism. How do you see the tension between this straight up conscious class conflict deploying weapons consciously and the tension between this particular class of institutional organizational strategies and both ideology and legal architecture of liberalism?
Let's take that. All right. I think that tension exists always and everywhere, but I think it's obscured on the corporate side by virtue of the fact that people being at the behest, of course, of corporations themselves, a little bit blind to the way in which corporations aggregate enormous political power, exert coercion over stakeholders, my least favorite term, but popular with my corporate colleagues, all the time. And yet the ways in which they purport to speak for others, they try to coerce others, is obscured as being not coercion that the law needs to worry about, or not coercion at all. And so it's there, it's just where we choose to see it. And I think, as Diana and Laura both pointed out, there has been a very deliberate effort to focus the attention of the public, including civil libertarians, on the ways in which groups extract consent or shape perception of their members, their constituents, without ever paying very much attention to the way in which other organizations in society, whether that's religious organizations, corporate organizations, or anybody else, shapes perceptions and uses and controls behavior and uses that to achieve political power as well as economic power.
That's great. I agree with much of what Catherine said, and there's so much in this question, but let me just maybe pick a couple of things to focus on. One is that I do think that, and this actually ties into Diana's paper too, I do think in some sense that labor made a strategic mistake in accepting the frame of coercion and embracing liberal legalism. And I don't just mean this in the institutional story sense of embracing the courts and judicial review. I think it was a much broader sort of acceptance in the political culture of this framework of coercion as a problem. And they sort of abandoned the group rights alternative much too quickly and tried to frame unions as an engine of solidarity. And it's, I mean, this is, you know, we talked a little bit about this when we had a conversation among the panelists. There's a trade-off in the language of association and sort of social movement activism that actually, I think, gives up some of the power that unions need to exercise in order to be effective. Now, whether that might have been more acceptable in the absence of the NLRA and its structure of state action, which made those the sort of background exercise of state power made this more problematic to sort of cling to. So I guess a way of putting this is, could those sorts of coercive powers come back and be more acceptable in the absence of majority rule and exclusive representation, perhaps. I'm still sort of puzzling through that question. But I do think it is certainly the case that, you know, in the 1940s, there were people pressing for this idea that once a union reached decision, not only was it binding on the union as a whole, but that that members of the bargaining union who disagreed with it should not be free to articulate that view in public, right? Which is really remarkable when we think of sort of what was on the table in terms of what union power would be, lest they lose their job, right? Lest they be excluded from the closed shop agreement. You know, that kind of power, I think, is unthinkable and is, just as Catherine said, really uncomfortable for a lot of people who embrace labor unions today.
Absolutely. And I would just also add that I think one of the ways in which I tend to break away from maybe some of the more critical views of law is that I'm not sure that law is inherently anything or that it has one fixed relationship with any of these other broader social processes. I think part of what I learned through a lot of this work was that, you know, I mean, and as we all know, the meaning of law changes all the time, in part through the hard work of mobilized groups. And so I think one of the real losses that I see is that the labor movement, as the largest movement that's really focused on primarily on economic inequality, particularly in the workplace, has shied away from, I think, really claiming the incredible normative force of legal discourse. And of course, what's so amazing, and this is what we know from critical race theory, that you know, rights are both a discourse and ultimately then an institutional way of structuring society. And notwithstanding the fact that they're a constant battleground, I think it's hard not to think that something was lost in labor unions kind of refusing to play and engage in that battle.
Question in the back.
I just wonder if anything that ever happened outside the United States had any impact on the stories you're telling, or the stories you're telling had any impact on anything that happened outside the United States.
Could you restate that for me?
Sure. Question is, what impact did these developments have outside the United States and vice versa? What impact outside the United States have here?
I mean, I can just briefly say, and I'm someone who studied anthropology at a time when anthropology was really kind of ashamed of its role in the colonial project. And so because of that, I tend to just be like, I only study what I know, which I think is a problem. I think partly the story that I'm telling is one of American exceptionalism, because this distinction between economics and rights does not exist in the constitutional, or at least not to the same extent, in the constitutional and legal regimes of many other countries where labor movements are more powerful. They fight their own battles, but this like bright line between, you know, economics is over here and rights are over there, that's largely an American thing, and I think it creates another opportunity to think about how laws can regulate labor differently.
I can jump in. I'll say, you know, the story I'm telling is one that sort of unfolded within the United States, but was very much in conversation with, I mean, so there's various ways in which the rest of the world sort of came in. One, of course, was in the form that the very strong role, I think, in both of our stories of the Cold War. And that certainly influenced the thinking. So all of the rhetoric on the NAM and chamber side, and also was a big part of why they were able to drum up so much support for their political leaders. But I also think that the comparison, you know, I just mentioned majority rule and exclusive representation. Unions were thinking through what that cost them, and they were looking abroad for alternative examples. You know, the United States is unique in that relatively. And so I think that, you know, I certainly want to look to other possibilities and examples as I think through the sort of future implications of the project.
Right. I am really tempted to keep things going, but I'm getting the signal that at least for the first panel, we have to try to keep on time. So first, join me again and thank you.